I'm Dane Rose. Trauma, and with it, the tailspin of reinforcing patterns and energy is one of the most difficult things to transcend or escape, because with trauma comes a flooding, an overwhelming energy that blocks out all sense of perspective. And with that flooding comes a clinging to whatever is most solid, whatever is most certain. With the uncertainty of overwhelm and trauma comes an instinctive reaction to hold on at all costs to whatever is most familiar. And the reason it's to whatever is most familiar is that what is familiar is most certain. And what is most certain is most solid. And what is most solid instinctively feels like the best way out of uncertainty, out of overwhelm. Now, the catch-22 with highly traumatized individuals is that what is most certain and solid are the most painful recurring feelings: shame, terror, loneliness, and the most kind of destructive or contracting beliefs. I'm never going to be loved. I'm never going to amount to anything. I'm never going to belong. I'm never going to be valuable. No one will ever love me, etc. Everyone has thought these thoughts, and they often correspond or crystallize as the child experiences the volatility of interacting with larger masses. And the volatility game says that, well, the volatility equation goes something like this. Pain, shock, and helplessness combined is one of the lowest human resonances. It's one of the most undesirable human states. Pain, you can call that shame, humiliation, trauma, etc. Pain, combined with shock, which is volatility and uncertainty, and helplessness to prevent that, is such a horrifying energy that people will do just about anything to overcome it. And the thing with a child in relation to a volatile abuser is that the best way to overcome it is to create certainty about the abuse. So you have helplessness, shock or uncertainty, and enormous pain. Now, it is beyond the scope or ability of a child to transcend enormous pain being caused by a giant 5 times their size, by a culture 100 million times their size, etc., etc. And so the pain cannot be mitigated. So then the question becomes how to mitigate shock and helplessness. And children come up with an incredibly clever way of doing this. They eliminate the helplessness by participating in the abuse, internalizing the abuser and participating. They cut themselves. They humiliate themselves. They, get into fights on their terms. So this eliminates the helplessness. Now, the fact that they go into this proactively, it's called counterphobia, and many of the most sensitive people are prone to it, including myself. And the reason is to get rid of the suspense. We've all been in a horror movie where the music starts dun 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 dun, and then they come up with the clever idea of let's separate. Now that big danger, you go that way and I'll go this way. And it's and then if they really want to stick it to you, it'll be some 6-year-old girl in a white nightie, always a blonde or something. Like let's and that the juxtaposition of innocence and torment and whatever is going to create the most shock, and it's a shock movie. And so it's like, get the fucking thing over with. Just stab the little girl and be done with it, because there's the suspense. And so if you go into suspense, and particularly if just to do a little bit of an aside here, when shame, pain, and humiliation, and with it its violent, aggravants, are brewing in the family system, everyone knows what's going on. Dad's, gotten in the car without his driver's license and had one beer, and now he's gone off there. Then he's come back and had another beer. It's brewing. Now, the question is, do you want to be in helpless suspense for when the beating or whatever it is that's coming? Or do you want to kind of pop the bubble preemptively? And so someone that's counterphobic is going to precipitate the fight on their terms. Now, what you're doing is you're eliminating shock and you're eliminating the feeling of helplessness, but you're getting the same violence. So you've got enormous pain, trauma, violence, and then you've got shock and helplessness. The three combined are unbearable. And so children in various ways break the suspense, and they also decrease the volatility. Now, the volatility comes through Dad's very nice Monday, and he's very nice Tuesday, so you start to get your hopes up. But Dad's an alcoholic. Getting your hopes up is not a good idea. This is not going to magically go off into a sunset or anything like that. No, it's going to go up, and then it's going to crash down. Now, teenagers are particularly good because they feel humiliated about being jerked around by these large masses in the culture going up and down and up and down. And they just feel humiliated because the helplessness is evident by the fact that they can't hold their own state. And so they crash down with the abuse. And the abusers often, get off on this because they're trying to transfer the sense of helplessness. Because if you're not powerless, and you're not helpless, and you're not stuck, you don't hurt people. It's that simple. It's not a lot of fun unless you're in the same state yourself. And so you crash down. So teenagers in particular, they get crushed and humiliated in high school, of course, in an emotionally and relationally illiterate cult that refuses to teach them any useful life skills like how to negotiate with your parents, something every teenager could use, but let's not teach you that. How to flirt with the other sex, something every teenager is dying to know. Let's not tell them about that. Let's deny the teen any useful life skills for navigating the teenage years and cram them with rubbish like algebra that they're never going to use a day in their life. And then rather than own this sadistic setup, let's call it an education for your own good and then hit them, if they don't feel motivated to go and learn nonsense while being exposed constantly to situations they're incompetent to deal with in a culture that perpetuates relational incompetence, starting in high school. So you've got this dynamic. And then to top it off, you've got these hypocritical giants, building up and crashing you down and this whole thing. So the holding to the negative belief, I'll never amount to anything, I'll never be loved, what it does is it doesn't stop the crash, but it stops the volatility of movement. And so it reduces perceived humiliation. In other words, if you as a teenager can come in at complete cynical bottom of despair, my life's pointless, you might as well kill me, etc., etc., you think you're going to be fazed because your dad or your mom walked in and said, oh my gosh, you got a D in algebra, that most important subject that we all use every day. You got a D in algebra, oh my goodness, the world is going to come to an end that this skill that you've never going to use a day in your life hasn't been mastered. Meanwhile, we don't know what we're doing. We can't have a conversation about alcohol, whatever it is. Important skills we're going to completely ignore. And, this is mind-numbingly stupid from any objective perspective, but the teenagers got to live through this melodrama. And so, but if they've already decided, hey, life is fucked, I'm going to die, you're all assholes all the time, well, then this doesn't faze them. I was like, interesting. But, if they were getting their hopes up that they might actually have a sane family, that there might be an intelligent culture waiting for them to grow, and then this would be catastrophic news, because it's yet another wave of stupidity that's crashing down, on their hopes and dreams that, the world might actually be intelligent and worth engaging with. And so there's these deep-seated certain beliefs. I'm never going to be loved. I'm not this. And so when you hit a traumatic wave, the place that feels most familiar in an abuse cult tends to be fear, dark beliefs of, never this. Now, this provides certainty, but it also provides additional pain, because when you're not in a traumatized state, you can play around a little bit with other beliefs, like maybe today will be a nice surprise, or I believe in miracles, or whatever. I mean, not that many happen, but doesn't hurt to believe in them. I'm not going to be hit. When you're being hit broadside by large mass traumas, you feel like that's not certain. When's the last miracle that I've had, and did I predict it? And no, I can't hold on that. And when's the last time I was deeply and fully loved in this cult? Oh my goodness, I can't hold on to that No, I've got to hold on to these solid things that no one can knock off, because if you're holding on to I'm never going to be loved, and you get knocked by someone hating you again, well, it doesn't faze you because it's consistent. So you feel a sense of certainty and stability. And so this creates the tailspin of negativity, that the need for certainty at a time of trauma tends to establish itself in an identity around the wound, as opposed to the identity that in our culture is more nebulous around joy and well-being, etc. And so this makes getting out of a trauma tailspin, and a trauma tailspin is, the phenomenon of a plane, where they start spinning too much and it becomes impossible to get out of a nosedive. And the spin just takes you down faster and faster and faster until you hit the ground. That can wipe out a lifetime, particularly when there's so much illiteracy around the states involved, around the dynamics involved, and in a cult that would like to shift the blame and the responsibility for a tailspin that is co-created within the dynamics of the culture as a whole onto the individual. So this is the first thing to be mindful of, or that I reflect on in my own kind of vortice of pain and fear and suffering around this dynamic is just how difficult that has been to lift. Now, I understood this early on, and so I started making, videos, etc. But understanding something is very different from being able to change it. It's very much like the law of mass. A thought has a certain amount of weight. And the reality that the thought is engaging with has a certain amount of weight. When a giant interacts with a midget in a boxing round, the giant usually wins. The law of mass says that the larger object eclipses the smaller object. If a bowling ball and a pinball collide, the bowling ball carries on with undetectable slowing down. The pinball bounces back and is thrown off in a very different direction. And this law applies to groups versus individuals, individuals versus their cult or culture, individuals versus the family dynamic, children versus their parents, the citizen versus their government. You've got a huge law of mass involved. So that's I think the first thing that comes to mind to frame this dynamic. The second thing that comes to mind is cultural chauvinism. And here's, and chauvinism is not just the elevation of men above women, something that we're doing a relatively good job of, in some cases, tipping the other way. Chauvinism is the elevation of masculine energy over feminine energy in both men and women, which is why women can be the most avid chauvinists in the crushing of the femininity in other women and in the hatred and hostility towards femininity in men. I once got fired by an avid feminist for complimenting her on her marriage. And she admitted she was firing me for that compliment. And it was odd because I was one of 3% of contractors competent to do her type of job really, really well. And my price and schedule was right. And so, and what was interesting was that paying her that compliment was the most feminine thing that I did in our entire interaction. And firing me, or kind of deranking me for being feminine, was the most masculine thing that she did in the whole interaction. And it was very interesting and I kind of called her out on it. I said, you boast about being a feminist, but you attack men who express feminine energy. And you compete in a man's world, in a chauvinistic world, by being more chauvinistic than the men that you're in the room with, not by leading with your femininity. In other words, your version of being a feminist is to make as much money as the men you deal with by attacking femininity just like they do in yourself and in them. And so you fit in. You're all chauvinists. And like most chauvinists, she didn't want to hear anything, particularly from someone who's, feminine. So that was the end of that conversation. The feminine in men is the most feared and thus hated part of our culture, and making it vulnerable to love, to heal, and to heal this particular wound. And this lack of love for the feminine in men and in women, but it's, if you take the split, for example, women liking women, as in lesbian, most men are not bothered by this at all. Some men are turned on by it. You take the dynamic of homosexuality, and this is violently hated, at least in my generation, and lingering. And the amount of hostility that comes towards the feminine side in men is immense. And this is both blatant and passive. It's expressed by withdrawing, meaning the more tender I am towards another man, the more distance they often want. So that's kind of a semi-passive active saying, I don't want anything to do with your femininity towards me. And if you insist on being feminine, I will have nothing to do with you. And that's a rock-solid law in many male-male friendships. And so it's, I will associate with you on condition that you artificially suppress and deny your feminine side. Well, every human being has the hierarchy of human needs. Level 3, love and belonging. Love and belonging for the whole person, or love and belonging just for the masculine side or half of the individual. How do you function when you're only allowed to be half of an individual, and when you're only allowed to express half of who you are? Now, this hostility extends to women who often resent and actively hate men who have emotional need. Neediness is a dirty word in chauvinistic cults, both among women and men. I would say that there's probably been at least 30 women in my life who have kind of stumbled into some emotional need in the interaction, and then discovered in aghast surprise, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I'm needy, I'll go take care of this. I know that in a shame cult, you will hate me and find me unsexy for having emotional needs, so I apologize that all my control and shame of my emotional needs wasn't enough to stop this bubbling up spontaneously. I'm so sorry. I will go and cry elsewhere. I will come back later when I'm presentable, as in not in a feminine state. And then, the amount of men that have pulled away or said no, or, you do not have permission to hug me ever, or anything like that. It's always an attack on my feminine side. And the amount of hostility and kind of, why would I want to have sex with you when you're feminine? I want to have sex with a real chauvinist asshole who's going to tell me, this way and that way, and not take, and who's going to join me in shaming my femininity. And so, the women are, of course, patronized like men for being feminine, but they're not usually actively hated in the way that men are. And so I would say that for whatever reason in our cult, it is a cult because there's nothing scientific about it. You can't say, oh my gosh, we have a nation of lonely, addicted, disenfranchised men. I know the most scientifically effective way to remedy this dis-ease is to punish any man for being affectionate to another man. Now, that's actually medicinal given the cult's status. So it's actually cult-like, because it's the opposite of science and logic and reason to perpetuate a dogma which has no basis. It's the antithesis of a scientific basis. And so you have a dogma, you have a cult. And so this is a tremendously thick cult pattern. I would say that it expresses itself in 1,000 different ways by shifting the dynamic that occurs in American interactions by between 15 and 80% in any given interaction. That there is an unnatural cult and dogmatic shunting away from feminine energy and emphasizing of the masculine energy, even when it's inauthentic, because of this hatred and fear of the feminine. And why that is deeply tied to trauma and the feminine's connection with vulnerability and the unknown and feelings. The more sociopathic a cult is, and inducing trauma into a trauma-illiterate cult, and then failing to repair the trauma and shaming the person for demonstrating traumatic symptoms, is about as sociopathic as it gets. So in a sociopathic cult, the feminine energy of the feelings in the body are attacked hard. Now, in a cult that is too ignorant and spiteful towards itself to remedy this, that is answered with an aspiration to disown and transcend the feminine, which is why cool is desirable. I mean, you think about it. What is so desirable about being cool? Well, first of all, you place cool on the sociopathic-empathic continuum. And being cool is all about being sociopathic. A sociopath is not affected by cruelty, by humiliation. A sociopath is untouchable because they have no feelings. And this is what every teenager, having experienced intense humiliation without repair, aspires to. I want to be able to shift the shame and low rank from me to someone else. One, because in a sociopathic cult, someone is going to be hurt. I just don't want it to be me. And two, if I do get attacked, my whole game is to pretend that I'm a sociopath and that the attack doesn't affect me. And I will never let them see me cry as the epitome of the empathic human being aspiring to a sociopathic state in which they can put off an adequate performance that demonstrates that they have no feelings and that the other person is incapable of altering their human state, which is the state of a sociopath. So empathic, warm, cool, sociopathic. In a traumatically illiterate cult, you aim to appear sociopathic or to be sociopathic because in a sociopathic cult, being treated well is off the table. It's not a negotiable item. The only thing negotiable is how numb you're going to be when the pain hits. And so thus the aspiration in a trauma-illiterate sociopathic cult to be cool and, barbaric. But that's where we are in a cult that refuses to spend a single hour in the most vulnerable years of a person's life in high school, a single hour on emotional literacy, relational illiteracy, sexual literacy, and trauma literacy. We're going to take the most important aspects of a human's education, and we're not only not going to spend a single hour talking about them, or let alone a few days, heaven forbid. we're going to shame you and humiliate you in those years in direct proportion to your ignorance about the things we won't tell you about, and your vulnerability about the things we don't protect you around, and your feelings, which are apparently, in our cult, a teenager's worst nightmare to be caught feeling, because in a shame cult, the shame of the abuser gets transferred to the shame of the victim. So in an empathic cult, you are challenged for abusing someone. But in a sociopathic cult, you are shamed for being the butt of the joke. And the person who was witty enough to pass their shame on to you is elevated as, again, the underlying logic is someone's going to be treated like shit in a shame cult, in an abuse cult. The person who treats the other person like shit is high-ranking, and the person who receives the shit is low-ranking. But it's a given that shit will be passed because the cult is too ignorant, too insane, too self-loathing to actually eliminate and heal the pattern of abuse. And so instead it ranks and says it's better to be an abuser than it is to be a victim. So if you can make witty remarks, humiliate, be richer than, do all the things that give you high rank in a cult of abuse, then you won and the other person lost. And often shame-based parents, if your child loses, meaning if your child didn't humiliate the other kid but was humiliated, the parent will add to more humiliation to what? Humiliate them out of being humiliated? This is where you know you're dealing with a cult rather than dealing with an intelligent society. It's not rational. It's dogmatic. It's cult-like. It's absurd. So the birth in me of my feminine side has been an incredibly delicate, tenuous, pain, it's been incredibly vulnerable and incredibly terrifying and incredibly painful and incredibly humiliating, because far from learning attunement dynamics or regulation of the feminine, there's just this violation and extreme on-off, switches that make it feel as if I'm going to die by embodying my feminine side. And the interesting kind of dynamic with the psychedelic experience with Peter Sandhill is that it was a forced birth of the feminine, in the sense that, suppressing the critical protections through MDMA, opening, the heart without critical feedback, allowing a violator, meaning Peter Sandhill doesn't know how to honor the femininity in himself or his wife or his clients. He doesn't know how to do that. And, why would he? Why would a male who has been shamed and traumatized their entire life in their own feminine learn this great art of treating the feminine as sacred? And there's nothing more feminine than innocence, than wonder, than the unknown. This is one reason that traumatic cults hate the feminine. The feminine is the unknown. In the polarity between the known and the unknown, the feminine is the unknown. In the polarity between the particle and the space, the feminine is the space. And the universe is 99% space. The space between an electron in an atom and I think it's a proton, is 99% space. The feminine is vast. The unknown is vast. And you don't want vastness and uncertainty and the unknown when you're in trauma. So the more traumatized the cult, the more it fears the feminine and thus hates the feminine. And I would guess that this is one of the biggest reasons that men attack homosexual men, is because it puts other men into the vulnerability of, I don't know how to relate to you, so I'm going to kill you for bringing me into uncertainty. So I'm going to shame you. So I'm going to beat the shit out of you because you're making me feel uncertain. And I have a traumatic history in a traumatizing cult. And I'm clinging to some certainty so that I don't feel the helplessness and volatility on top of that unresolved trauma. And then you have the audacity to behave in a way that I don't know how to respond to you, and I feel humiliated, and I'm going to beat the shit out of you for making me be aware of how much I don't know that I don't know, how much I don't know how to respond, because that makes me vulnerable. You have made me feel vulnerable, and I'm going to beat the shit out of you for it. And the same is true for parents with gay children. I mean, I know how to throw a ball at someone. I don't know how to be a dad and hand you the lipstick. So I'm going to beat the shit out of you because you're making me feel inadequate as a parent, which of course I am, but I don't want to feel that way, and so I'm going to beat the shit out of you. And so the birth in me is, of my feminine side has been incredibly traumatic, incredibly fearful in this dynamic. And, obviously for logical reasons. And, you only have to grow up watching the movies of American culture to realize you could be killed for expressing your feminine side. And it is a traumatic thing to be shamed, excluded, and rejected from a social system. Meaning, in the hierarchy of human needs, survival, security, love, and belonging. Level 3 is love and belonging. But what's interesting about this hierarchy of human needs is they each build on the others. Meaning, to have love and belonging in a world populated by human beings is the most effective way to secure security about survival, the first two. Meaning, if you don't fit in a globe populated by human beings and run by money, you're not secure in your survival. And if you're actively hated, the odds of you surviving as well as someone else are very low. If you live in constant fear and anxiety, you die early. You get sick more. You go to hospital more. You have bigger medical bills. You have higher therapy bills. You earn less. You are killed off effectively day by day if you do not receive the blessing of survival or of love and belonging. And so a cult that dogmatically says that everything feminine in a man is to be hit, shamed, discouraged, ignored, not talked about, not loved and belonged, is a cult in which men will internalize the abandonment and shame of their own femininity, their own yin, the listener, the receiver, the one in wonder, the one that responds, the deeply emotional, sensitive side, the one who empathizes. The feminine, half of the human being, will be shut and shoved down, which creates dis-ease. It creates imbalance, which creates dis-ease. Try driving a wheel with half of the wheel cut off. It's a very bumpy ride, as it should be. And the lesson is, don't cut that off. But dogmatic cults are not rational. They're insane. And so the response is hide it deeper. shame other men to show that you don't have any femininity. And gangs, of course, take this to a high extreme of, let's see, the initiation in the gang in Western cults always revolves around the murder of the feminine in the human being. So often the most feminine thing of a new gang recruit, for example, might be he still has a sister. Maybe they're orphans or whatever, but he still has a sister and likes his sister. So he might be asked to set up a rape for his sister to demonstrate that he has no more ties with the feminine. This is a gang that severs in ritualistic murder, that externalizes the murder that was first internalized by the gang members, etc., and that takes control. Again, they feel helpless to defend their own feminine in a shame-based abuse cult, such as our own. So they take their power back by murdering the feminine directly in themselves through some ritualized, maybe it's just a theft. You have to steal the money from your family and then you can be part of this gang. Why? Well, because then you're destroying your framework of relating, of family, which is a feminine dynamic. You're destroying the circle. Now you're alone and you've only got us. That's so you're dehumanizing the person with the rest of the world. And now you can be part of the gang of dehumanized, chauvinistic people who belong on the basis of their violation of the feminine. And this happens in gangs as an extreme, but it happens in men's clubs and all over the place in all kinds of ways. It happens in high school. This is a cult ritual of cult rank attainment by patronizing, shaming, and abusing the feminine. And the fuck as many girls as you can and not care about it is just one more kind of domain of that particular ritual of dehumanizing the male by pretending that there's nothing feminine in there, by pretending that somehow a man doesn't have any feelings when he connects with a woman's body. The dehumanizing stereotype. And he may cut off those feelings precisely because they are too shameful in a shame cult. Meaning he may have more feelings than a woman, but be more afraid of them and thus stab them down deeper in order to not risk the attack of the woman for what is often a very vulnerable feminine self that comes to the surface. Jung says, Carl Jung says that what is not loved and what is suppressed will regress, will become smaller, younger, darker, will regress, will deteriorate, may go insane, and will be hostile at the energy that failed to embrace and love it in the circle. So when a man takes his feminine side and shoves it down with hate, fear, and hostility, that feminine side regresses, becomes filled with rage, envy, bitterness, deterioration, starts to feel 5 years old, starts to feel, tantrum-like, becomes immature because hatred and hostility and exclusion and repression de-evolve the psyche. So they take it back to a 2-year-old unregulated state and then give it a wound. Well, just try beating a 2-year-old to within an inch of a life and then trying to get it to stop crying. It doesn't. It flails around, etc. That's what regressed energy does. So if men do that to their own masculine energy to satisfy the dictatorship of a real man as defined by the men women will have sex with, as defined by the cult of who will get elected in power, as defined by who's popular and who women want to fuck around with, in all these different ways, he has inside of him a shame-based, terrified, lonely, hurt, feminine energy that feels enraged and hostile towards him and towards the world that is demanding that he do that. And he slaps that feminine energy down and then externalizes that same template of masculine abusing feminine with the women he's in, and the chauvinistic women that he's with will reward and appreciate him for it. There's, a whole group of women in our era that prefer violent sexuality by someone who puts them down directly or indirectly. And this can be laughing at jokes that belittle them and actually being aroused by humiliation. I've experienced a fair amount of that. It's the whole setup becomes a relationship of abuse. So the feminine in me was incredibly vulnerable, weak, uncertain, desperate for love, and got hit down pretty hard with rejection, with failing to hold container, with failing to get to know her, failing to respect and honor boundaries, failing to honor her value and worth, and so went into the darkest wound in our culture of the hated, unloved feminine self who hates itself as a way of taking control of the helplessness of being abandoned, and then seeks vengeance on the world that systematically and meticulously inflicts this wound in 1,000 different ways, and then has the cowardice to blame the regression of feminine. It's kind of like throwing someone out of the boat into cold water 500 times, and every time they claw up to the boat, you throw them out again. And then you blame them for being stressed, anxious, and traumatized, rather than having the decency to grow up and actually be an adult and show some kindness, love, and care for that feminine side, which then grows into this magical queen capable of blessing, capable of healing, capable of restoring life, of restoring grace to a life, and making it worth living, if given half the chance. And so you have the science and the intelligence, which in those areas where a culture responds, gathers the relevant data about well-being, responds to it, and does the most intelligent and efficient thing that is available on the menu to respond and create well-being. Well, there you have an intelligent culture. The cult in culture is the dogmatic repetition of some of the most sadistic and abusive patterns imaginable, just because that's what we do in this cult, and we don't want to think about it, and we don't want to respond. Causing and allowing are connected, meaning, one of the ways that behavior splits down is, parent hits child, abuser, victim, therapist abuses patient, abuser, victim. You have an influencer and then you have someone who allows the influence. This is the masculine and the feminine. The one that says, how about it, is in the masculine position. The one that says yes is in the feminine position. Feminine and masculine have nothing to do with gender. The feminine is hated long before women were hated. Women are only hated because due to the biology, women have a slightly more higher probability of expressing femininity. And similar to the body, men have a slightly higher probability of expressing masculine energy. And so in any dynamic, there is a polarity. Someone says, how about it? And someone says, yes, masculine, feminine. Someone speaks and someone listens, masculine and feminine. It's not about men and women. And truly so, women are climbing in cult rank to the degree that they are embodying sociopathic masculine tendencies. Okay, you show you can have a C-section and be back at work and give your baby to a maid and not interrupt this and that and make quippy remarks and not be emotional. You show that you can pathologically deny your masculinity as much as anyone else, fine. You can be Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher, terrific chauvinist. Why not? Or a CEO that's all about the numbers and is willing to ruin 50,000 families and send their work overseas to save a few pennies. You're able to do it? Great. You can have the job. You just have to prove your sociopathic nature, and we don't really care that much as long as you're not going to make us uncomfortable for our sexist jokes and all that. Causing and allowing are connected, which makes forgiving ourselves both necessary and difficult. Because in our cult ranking system, the one who abuses the other, when the masculine is abusing the feminine, that's okay. A man makes a cutting remark and a woman bursts into tears. She's too emotional. It's like, oh, why did you have to make the cutting remark? Because now we have to listen to her feelings, So the shame is towards the feminine, which particularly attacks sensitivity. And 10% or so of the population has a neurologically higher response in their brain, which means that they'll feel more than the other 80-90% of the population. They'll react more, etc. And so in that sense, someone who's sensitive, either as a woman or as a male, is going to be particularly targeted within chauvinism as being an irritant as opposed to a profound asset, which would actually honor nature's survival of the fittest strategy, that if nature believes 10 to 20% of several mammalian groups should be highly sensitive because that perpetuates the survival of the species, as evidenced by a large number of our inventions and scientists coming from highly sensitive people. In mathematics, you can think of an Einstein. Not a very butch guy, eh? But look at all the stuff that came from Einstein because of his sensitivity. And if nature is intelligent enough to bless a species with 10% divergence and neurological diversity in order to benefit the survival of the species, then it's rather cult-like, rather dogmatic and ignorant to turn around and attack that group in particular, just as if nature thought it was terribly brilliant if women didn't exist along with feminine energy, we would have a rapidly dying world. It would only last one generation, there being no women to conceive. And we'd have a world of talkers with no listeners, so there'd be no communication. We'd have a world of givers with no receivers, so there would be no exchange of energy. We'd have a world of teachers with no students, so nobody would learn or understand anything. And it would be incredibly boring. You cannot scientifically justify the stupidity of our chauvinism. It is simply a cult reenactment. Forgiveness. We forgive another at the same time we forgive ourselves. And we don't forgive at all when we're in a traumatic state. It's perfectly obvious. The reptilian brainstem is fight, flight, freeze. Forgive is empathic. You don't have empathy in a traumatic state. And so that's another expression of cultural ignorance when children are repeatedly traumatized by parents and then lectured by the bully of their priest or cult religion to forgive while they are still in a traumatic state, that the cult is too brutal to bother to understand, let alone repair. And so this is shaming, again, which is another form of trauma. It tells the child, you are not acceptable except if you can do the impossible. And we're not even going to give you the decency of understanding how lonely that is. Because there's nothing more lonely in a child's world than to be dependent on other human beings for survival, security, love, and belonging and self-esteem, and be asked to do something that is impossible to do, which requires a shameful secret that I am fundamentally unlovable, which is then reinforced by sociopaths who lack the capacity to love, as expressed by not even understanding the basic physiology of the brain, despite its availability, because we are a cult that persists in triumphing the right of parents who have no parental competency to have kids rather than the rights of kids to have competent parents. Now, to reverse that, we would, of course, have to reverse the political the political expediency of wanting to get votes from who? The parents, not the kids. We've denied their ability to vote. And so what brave politician in this great democracy is going to tell parents, we're putting the rights of your kids above your rights, and we want you to vote for us, to vote us in power. And so we forgive another the same time we forgive ourselves. And the only time that we forgive ourselves is when we love ourselves. Love is necessary in order to transcend the reptilian brain and move into the limbic and up into the rational brain. Love is necessary for that. Which means there's a lot of catch-22s around this. Because how do you love yourself if you're clinging to certainty, and the thing that is most certain is I'm never going to be loved and I'm unlovable, because so often you get knocked down into that terrain as expressed by not a single human being on the planet at any number of moments, at the vast majority of moments in life, truly understanding and competently loving us. When we have no template for that, it's incredibly difficult. And so then we reenact the abuse, reenact the shame, because that template is solid and we can cling to it in a familiar state. But in doing so, forgiving someone else is out of the question. We forgive someone else quite organically at the very moment we truly forgive ourselves, which is at the very moment we transcend the traumatic state and return to a grace of self-love with competency and certainty. If it can be knocked down at any moment, there's no certainty, so there's no forgiveness. for self or other. Now, why do we forgive the other when we love ourselves? Well, first of all, they kind of go hand in hand. It ties in a little bit with the connection between allowing and causing. Every child blames themselves for their parents abusing them. 6-year-old girls being raped repeatedly by their father tell the judges in courts, my dad's a good person. I should have locked the door in my own house. It's my fault that a giant raped my little body because what? I didn't do this, or I made mom mad, and then mom didn't want to have sex with dad, and then dad had to fuck me, of course. I mean, he couldn't have done anything else. And then, of course, this cult had to cover it up. And of course, it's my fault, right? So we forgive because it's fun and it's natural. When we are loved with certainty, when we love ourselves with certainty and can maintain a state of well-being, we forgive ourselves. It's a complicated dynamic because in one level the forgiveness comes before lifting out of the reptilian brain, because without forgiveness there's self-hatred, which compels us down into the reptilian brain to block out the pain of the self-hatred and the trauma, and bring us back into fight, flight, freeze, which can't forgive. On the other hand, when in a traumatic state, one cannot lift out of the reptilian brainstem because there is no love. And this is why trauma, more than anything else, requires help, certainty, and group dynamic. You can kind of think of the phenomenon of a drowning person in a traumatic state. They are as likely to drown their rescuer as they are to be pulled out. However, if you have a group of 5 or more people in support, they'll lift the traumatized person out with a level of certainty that will allow the traumatized person to very rapidly de-escalate, from PTSD and address the trauma with support and then move on. And so, a culture of abundance and intelligence is a culture that develops traumatic competence. And 5 or 6 people, even 3 that are highly trained, but 5 or 6 people that know basic trauma etiquette and understand the imperative of providing certainty and solidness long enough for the person to transcend the PTSD and return to trauma and then heal the trauma and come back to the normal empathic brain state. That is a human right. And it is right because it is intelligent, meaning there is no faster way for a group of people to dramatically reduce the energy costs of creating a unit of well-being than to eliminate the trauma in their midst. And there is trauma in the midst of 80% of our cult. It may not be triggered in the moment, it may be masked, it may be medicated, it may be addicted, all kinds of things. But 80% of our population is dealing with chronic trauma. And the most intelligent path, the right path, making it a human right to receive traumatic help, is to have certainty competently provided as needed until the traumatic state is left. And it takes about 5 people who say, you're going to be okay. We are going to see to it. If you need something, one of us is here. What do you need? How can we help? You're going to survive. You are going to be secure in your survival. We love you, and you belong in this group. You meet those needs. That is the antithesis of trauma. Trauma is the threat of not meeting one's human needs, the threat of death, financially, emotionally, socially, physically, in health, culturally. It is the fear of death, the death of the identity, the financial identity, the social identity, etc. So you must have a group of people that provide that certainty, lift the trauma. Then the person is perfectly capable of taking care of on their own. And this is, of course, the opposite of what we do when people enter states of trauma, and we go through the perfunctory social cult ritual of saying, hey, how are you? And then start to walk by. If they either retreat into isolation and shame, understanding that in a shame-based abuse cult, the fact that they have been abused puts them at the bottom of the pecking order, and they will actually be attacked if they reveal that they need help. This is part of chauvinism. Or they start to answer and say, I really need help here, and are avoided in consequence, are met with anger and frustration or fear in consequence, because we are a trauma illiterate cult and people do not have the competency to respond. Either way, the trauma escalates as it becomes inevitable that you're in a shame cult where you will be punished for speaking the truth about the trauma and you will not receive help. Only in this catch-22 of the cult, when you do not need anyone and you're cheerful and shadow averse, meaning when you're not demonstrating any of the shadow side of our cult, then you will receive support when you don't need it. It's kind of like the banks. They'll loan you money when you don't need it. They will refuse all money to the people who really need money. And then they'll give lots of money to the people who don't need it. Well, it's the exact same principle in social circles. You'll be invited to all the parties when you are the life of the party and you don't want to go to parties. And as soon as you're desperate and lonely, we don't want you around because we're sociopaths. We want to give more to the people who don't need more, and we don't even want to talk to the people who really need. We want to give more to people who are masculine in their confidence and competence, and we want to punish those in a feminine state. So, in that dynamic, it becomes very difficult to transcend the trauma state. And then in an insane cult, in a trauma illiterate cult, the response is you spend more energy building walls than you do helping people so that they wouldn't want to violate. When a billionaire moves in to a poor neighborhood and is naturally afraid because, of course, he couldn't possibly share any of the billions. That would be intelligent or empathic. So that would be feminine. That would be to acknowledge that the circle is as valuable as the one. But in a chauvinistic cult, the one is more valuable than the circle that creates the one. The one doesn't exist without the circle. The masculine doesn't exist without the feminine. The male does not exist without the female. That's the science. The cult chauvinism is to blame the feminine in all of its expressions, including female, for all kinds of problems, and treat it like shit, while depending on it every step of the way. And as it deteriorates and regresses under that abuse dynamic, hit it some more and blame it for looking bad. Let's have slavery, and then blame the slaves for being ungrateful and things. I mean, there's just classic, abuse dynamics. But we're so hostile towards the feminine, we don't even teach abuse dynamics, because then we might have to change them, and we don't want to. We want to attack the feminine in men and in women. Now, this wall of imbalance is a very interesting thing. One of the things that's very interesting is you think of pedophilia, for example, and why exactly would a 45-year-old woman want to have sex with a 6-year-old boy or something like that? I mean, what's driving that chemistry? And you can look at it as well, let's take two individuals. So one person is a billionaire and one person is barely able to survive. So you have them side by side. Now, it's a very vertical dynamic. So you're way up here and partner B is down here. Now, the ecological nature of reality understands grace occurs with symmetry. Grace occurs with symmetry. The wheel is a graceful shape. Driving in a car with round wheels feels graceful, feels smooth. It's great, it's relaxed. If you drove in a car where half of the tire was 10 times, 1,000,000 times bigger than the other half, it would be a violent experience. It's not graceful. And for this reason, water, a very graceful thing, moves to level equality. So the ecological awareness of our interconnectedness moves us naturally towards balance, towards grace. And empathy is one of the leverages, for that. And so in a healthy dynamic, if you've got 1,000,000 times more than you possibly could do anything useful with, and so is in pain, you move the energy to respond out of empathy, and the thing gets equal, and you don't need a wall. You don't need a gated community to keep your friends out. But you do need a gated community. You do need fighter jets. You do need stuff in order to maintain an artificial disparity that is enormous and unnecessary. You absolutely need walls for that, because it's atrocious. It's an absolute violation of the feminine, because the feminine says we're part of a circle together, and the species survives better. You can look at it in so many different ways. Do you think a billionaire is protected from antibiotic-resistant viruses? Of course not. Just because you've got $1 billion doesn't mean that you can, have a whole new species of medicine that nobody else has? No. If an antibiotic-resistant virus gets into a billionaire, they die just like anyone else. So who creates antibiotic-resistant viruses? Poor people who are too in survival to finish their course of antibiotics. So they take half their course, the virus disappears, they're scrambling to survive, they don't take the other half, and then the virus comes back and mutates and becomes an antibiotic-resistant form of virus. That kills billionaires with the same degree of impartiality as it kills anyone else. Who cultivates the greatest probability of a virus in a community? Homeless people. Why? Because 42% of them have PTSD, because they're shamed every day by an abuse cult, because they're cold, wet, and hungry. And they make contact with each other and spread viruses rapidly. And antibiotic-resistant disease strains breed and are homeless. And then who catches the disease after that? The sociopaths, who are in their little gated communities, who thought it was a good idea to maintain chronic homelessness in their community. That's who catches the diseases. And then they would spend millions for their little girl, right? The little rich kid, they'd spend millions. How did this happen? They won't even give a safe legal place to sleep for the person who bred the disease. And they're too dumb to understand it, because a chauvinist is self-centered. It's all about me. So why would they understand something ecological like the migration pattern of a disease? That's ecological thinking. That's feminine thinking. That's understanding the interconnectedness of things. A sociopath doesn't understand that. I'm rich. I'm going to buy health insurance, so I should be well. And the actions of poor people and sick people, nothing to do with me. So sociopaths create diseases by failing to be empathic. But this wall dynamic, it tends to express itself most if you have a very happy person and then 10 miserable people. And so you've got this dynamic. We're all miserable. You're happy. Well, it's the same problem. You either have to build a wall, a sociopathic wall, or the more time you happy person spends with the depressed people, the more they'll become depressed. Or the other way around, the more the depressed people will become happy. Now, in a closed system, this is a function of mass. So in a closed system, 10 sociopaths will destroy the trust and empathy of one empath, systematically. It works pretty obviously. 10 sociopaths each betray the trust of the empath. The empath starts to associate high volumes of pain with believing anyone because she's surrounded by sociopaths. So she stops believing, and she starts distrusting, and she stops caring, which means she has become a sociopath, and now there's a nice level playing field. So maybe the sociopaths, because they were believed, maybe they're 10% less sociopathic, and the empath, because it's 1 to 10, is now 90% more sociopathic. And now they all have a nice level playing field. This is the law of resonance. Whenever two resonances come into side proximity, the higher will go to the lower will go to the higher, or they'll both meet in the middle. And as a default, they'll meet in the middle, or the one with the most mass. So you get a beautiful, excited, alive, creative baby born into a sociopathic cult. Who's going to win? Is the baby going to lift up the cult to be enthusiastic, creative, curious, highly energized, giving, playful, and dynamic? Or is the cult going to bully and shame that beauty out of the infant and call that the maturation process? Now you're an adult because you're cynical, stupid, doing something you hate for bits of paper because everyone else wants those bits of paper more than they want you as a human being. So congratulations, you've now graduated the modern cult course on dehumanization. And so this wall of imbalance is a phenomena where there's often an attraction or a rapid movement. Particularly, this goes on in helplessness. If one person feels, it's very interesting when someone feels proud of themselves and you've got a lot of helpless bullies around, the person who's proud of themselves is often the target. The innocent one, the young blood, is targeted by the system to knock them into alignment with the system. Now, in a normal dynamic, the group will win. So in a normal dynamic, if 4 of your therapists, if your leadership body and your community say that you're a piece of shit, you're worthless, this isn't valuable, we don't care about who this part of you is. We don't want this need. We don't want this transparency. We don't like it. Get the fuck out of here. In a normal dynamic, the group will dominate the individual. And this, ties a lot in with the enormous kind of helplessness and rage and stuff of the regressed feminine. Just not able to maintain my own state in this dynamic, with the high facilitators because of the phenomena of mass. I'm in a regressed state, so everything is 5 times bigger anyway. But then there's dozens of people lining up to tell me that I'm not worth being seen. And one regress voice saying, "This doesn't make any sense. How can you teach me into me, you see, by hiding and secrecy? This doesn't make any sense. How can you help me as therapist by reenacting my childhood abuse? No, this doesn't make sense." But it's still regressed and traumatized. So in a closed system, the abusers will dominate if there's a group, if there's a mass. And secrets, of course, make that a lot easier. Which is one of the reasons why, if you're an abuse dynamic, the abuser is always often primarily motivated by secrecy, because only the abusers are benefited by the abuse, so to speak. So if particularly if laws have been broken and various things, the number one goal of the abuser is to keep secret because it maintains the scale relationship. So if it becomes transparent, now that the certainty of shutting it up is lost, because there's no more bullying dynamic of 10 people in a conscious state in a power dynamic bullying someone in a small state to go along with their version of reality, however crazy. And the high version of reality is insane. It's not an issue for the Human Awareness Institute that a facilitator sexually abuses a client. Not an issue. It's not an issue that a therapist doesn't know how to conduct their own relationships, but is giving advice to other people. No, not an issue. Abuse should be paid for rather than refunded money. I mean, all kinds of insane positions are being held, not because they're intelligent, not because they aren't as chauvinistic and abusive as any other, but because of the phenomena of scale and this deep biological memory in the regressed, abused child. You will die if you go against the larger mass. So this is a very important part of the dynamic to understand. And in a closed system, the smaller object in an imbalance like that will be consumed. The child will be consumed by the parent, the citizen consumed by the government, etc. And this, of course, happens at all different levels. If you looked at the frenetic activity of Joe Biden and Obama to hunt down, remove the passport from, arrest, and condemn Edward Snowden into a trial in which the core tenet of this kind of military trial is that the one who's being convicted, Edward Snowden, is not allowed to explain to the jury why he did what he did. Now, of course, he did what he did because he swore an oath to the Constitution and to the country. He did not swear an oath of obedience to break the law or go along with his bosses breaking the law. And his bosses broke the law and violated the Constitution millions of times and are still doing it. And so in an abuse cult, you have to silence the truth teller. The truth teller is the enemy of an abuse cult, because the truth teller brings data into the equation, brings science, brings reason. And cult is subdata. Cult is fear of change. Cult is fear of the unknown. Cult is fear of the feminine. So the last thing you want is data that would lead to change. And so abuse cults are all about setting up scam, sham trials and stuff that convict anyone that violates the cult, even if the cult is destroying the well-being of the people involved, as is often the case. So in this case, the high power structure is destroying the well-being of a client, of a patient, of the community, and of themselves and of their mission. But that's not the point. You've got to expel the truth teller, because the truth teller brings change to the power structure, which brings uncertainty, which exposes us to the unknown, which is a feminine state. The unknown. It's neutral, the unknown. Things could be a lot better or they could be a lot worse. But the traumatic individual, the traumatized individual, is terrified of the unknown, because their orientation is towards fear and the negative of the reenacted trauma. Because anyone who has not dealt with trauma adequately anticipates that it will happen again, which it will, and anticipates that they will not be able to adequately deal with it again, which is true. And therefore, the unknown becomes a terrifying place of projected future trauma. This is why we will not transcend chauvinism until we become trauma literate. We will hate and attack the feminine as a cult, as a shame-based, abuse, chauvinistic cult, until we deal with chauvinism. We will be chauvinistic until we become trauma literate. This makes trauma literacy and response the single most important scientific breakthrough for a cult on its way to becoming a science-based culture in which love and competency pair in a natural partnership, in which you love enough to care, you care enough to understand, you understand enough to empathize, you empathize enough to attune, you attune enough to become competent, you become competent enough to succeed. Succeed at what? Creating abundance, of course, creating well-being. That's what we're all looking for. You create enough abundance and success to create safety, to create gratitude, to create well-being, to create pleasure. And love erupts. And now love is a virus that ripples out into the community. So there's this wall of imbalance in a closed system. And what's important to understand is that the closed system is an illusion. It is an illusion that is formed by the fear of the unknown, which allows us to only reference a very small thing. So, for example, in my terror, the more traumatized I became, the more I clung to the facilitators. Why? Because 4 of my therapists were in there. My workshop leaders, my primary source of love and belonging was the high community. And so this became the only way that I was going to transcend trauma. So I clung. But I wasn't going to transcend trauma by embodying shame, insanity, lies, and abuse. I was going to transcend trauma by being treated with dignity. And this meant telling the truth to the community, which didn't really want to hear it. So it deepened the shame, it deepened the trauma. And so the trauma didn't lift until I took all the eggs which were in the belonging basket of the high community and the facilitators and started sharing them around the world and finding that not everyone needed me to keep a secret or to be a shame-based secret in order to love and help me belong. And this is also what I talked about in terms of causing and allowing. I allowed and caused for facilitators doing shamanic work and stuff. I put the eggs in the one basket. And so the fact that so much harm erupted, that so much fear and so much ignorance was directed at me from my primary source of love and belonging, it escalated into PTSD. There also became, you reach for love and belonging to get out of trauma. And when those who you reach for have a primary agenda of secrecy and a secondary agenda of supporting you, they cannot be sane. Because secrecy is not sane. It's part of the abuse cult. It's not a school or a teaching or an awareness to pass on. You too can learn how to abuse people and then cover it up. Aren't you lucky? I mean, we don't need to learn that. Our cult is great at teaching that. Just watch the U.S. government for a single year and everything that they do to anyone who tells the truth of any of their abuse dynamics. And, Edward Snowden is a national hero who champions the Constitution, and he is the most feared person in America today. Psychedelic drugs that reveal the truth, the most feared thing in Nixon's world. Nixon thinks Timothy Leary is the most dangerous person in America. Then Martin Luther King, Now, in all of these cases, it is change that is feared. And anyone with unresolved trauma is terrified of change. It's not an accident that most American presidents are terrified of change and will attack and kill their own people to prevent it. That's not an accident. That is a representation of the ego consciousness that is terrified of the unknown and the feminine and will kill off parts of itself that threaten to bring a new life and being, even if it kills us, even if we're smoking, addicting and stuff, fine, as long as there's no change. Now, in a closed system, the small person always wins, and in a traumatized system, you want it to be closed, you stay with what's familiar. The truth is, however, that the universe is really, really big. And so there is no closed system. And there is always support and help from the transcendent energies that are in the field around each one of us. That is more than enough to overcome any closed system imbalance of scale. And this is where you have the transcendence of someone like Martin Luther King, etc., moving a whole country forward, or a Kennedy or a Gandhi or something. It's one against a country, a nation, but it's not one. It's one aligned with a field that is infinitely bigger than the fear and shame of a small minority. And yes, you can kill the body. There's a vulnerability there. But it shifts the consciousness into, a larger state that kind of dissolves this imbalance. And the key is to understand that there is a world that is more real than this world. There is a world for whom this world is the dream, the illusion. And there is abundance and infinite energy in that world. And all things in this world flow out of that world through consciousness, through imagination, through thoughts, through choices, through beliefs, through attitudes, through desires, expectations. All things flow from that world into this world. And in that world, There is no issue with dominance and mass. It's just that in a chauvinistic cult, the unseen world, the more real world, is feared, denigrated, poo-pooed, pushed aside, patronized, and driven out of people with humiliation and all this, so that it cannot be of aid to anyone seeking a transcendent state. Transcending what? Transcending the illusion, transcending the myopia of cult thinking. You cannot transcend something that you believe is the only reality. And so there is no transcendence within materialism, reductionism, and materialistic, reductionistic, linear science. There's no transcendence. It's a pure dynamic of physical mass and emotional mass. And it's wonderful watching Elon Musk with all of his companies have a belief and certainty in both the future and in physics and in himself that transcends. I mean, it transcends the media's skepticism. It transcends being the biggest shorted stock on Wall Street. It transcends all of the experts. Elon Musk has created the world's best space company, the best space company the world has ever known or seen is SpaceX. It does more reliably, cheaper, and more efficiently than any other space company in history, period. The Tesla cars, the safest, best cars ever built, bringing the future of electric energy. Neuralink, a new interface with the brain. The Solar City, rapidly becoming one of the most important sustainable energy companies in the world. And I have looked at the underlying stuff and read the biographies and stuff and watched over 500 hours of data. And it's generally the cult with its various media organizations and things and oil and gas interests and stuff come on and do their bullshit year after year after year. And Elon just does what he believes. And that belief doesn't depend on others. It's coming from something that transcends culture. It's incredibly powerful, and it levels the playing field in a way that you would otherwise need an equal number of people to advocate for a change. And so these are some of the things that I reflect upon as, I guess it's the beginning of 2020, as a lot of the trauma falls away with healing and love and self-forgiveness and forgiveness of the cult, the world, the pattern. It's not just something limited to Peter Sandhill or the facilitators, in particular. This is a cult. This is a cult wound, and it requires cult healing. And that healing does not come from the mathematics of the closed system of our cult. That healing comes from the transcendence, from the turning to the unlimited field energy that is always inviting us into the mysterious unknown of a more intelligent complexity, of a more advanced culture based on data, based on awareness.